Well, sir.
Good evening,
Shall we
sir.
start? Yeah. Okay. So I welcome you all to this another event of iSPELL, which is known as Indian Society for the Promotion of English Language and Literature, which was formed on 5th of September 2020 during the lockdown. And since the lockdown is continuing, but our activities are also continuing with the same pace as the lockdown. Though we haven't locked down ourselves, but during the pandemic, we started the activities to go like pan-academic. And indeed, it's a pleasure to have Dr. Prantik Banerjee as the chief speaker of today's event, with Dr. Murali Krishnan, who is going to chair the session, Dr. Shabnam Das Manna, who is going to master the ceremonies, and we have with us Priyanka Sharma, who is going to moderate the entire session. So let's begin with the introduction of the moderator. Mrs. Priyanka Sharma graduated from Rajasthan University in the year 2016, and now she is pursuing her PhD from Chhattisgarh College, Raipur. And she has done MPhil also, and currently she is pursuing her PhD under Dr. Kirti Tiwari from Raipur. The topic of her research is Canopy of Nature over the novels of Amitabh Ghosh, an eco-critical study. And she has participated in various national and international seminars and published few of her papers. And she is a regular attender of all the e-conferences of iSPELL, and she is also a very active member of iSPELL. Over to Priyanka Sharma.
Hello, thank you very much, sir, for that very generous introduction. Hello and a warm welcome. Sir, am I audible? Am I audible and visible? Because
Yes, both.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Hello and a warm welcome to you all to this webinar organized by iSPELL CG Forum. I am Priyanka Sharma, a research scholar from Government JY Chhattisgarh College, Raipur, and I welcome you all. Founded in December 2020, iSPELL CG Forum has till date conducted many webinars, lecture series, and many other activities. And of course, it does not need any introduction, but still as a custom, I should tell, iSPELL CG Forum is a branch of iSPELL India. And under the able guidance...
Excuse me, Priyanka, it's not iSPELL CG Forum, it's iSPELL India which is organizing it.
Okay, I'm so sorry. I'm really sorry for that. I thought it was CG Forum event. I'm really sorry for that. So, under the able guidance of Dr. Ghanshyam sir and Jyoti Patil madam and other members of iSPELL India, iSPELL is continuously working for the betterment of students and learners, and giving them direction and steering them to the path of knowledge. iSPELL Indian Society for the Promotion of English Language and Literature has a single motto: facilitate to elevate. And today we are adding another chapter to iSPELL India, and this webinar is rather intriguing, thought-provoking, and interesting, as the title is Bleeding Histories and Healing Wounds, Traumas of Writing. As I said, the title is very thought-provoking and intriguing, as some writers write for their own pleasure. Some writers write to heal themselves, and yet there are some other people who are brave enough to go to the bleeding history to get to the truth. And today we might get some insight into that by Dr. Banerjee, Prantik Banerjee sir, who is giving this lecture today. Dr. Prantik Banerjee sir is Associate Professor of English in Hislop College of Nagpur. So now I cordially invite Dr. Shabnam Das Manna madam, the Master of Ceremonies for today's program. Dr. Manna madam has 15 years of extensive experience in the teaching of English language and literature in business and communication skill to students and professionals. She crafts, customizes, and delivers training in the aforementioned areas for college and corporates. Dr. Shabnam also conducts pre-placement training programs for students of engineering and business administration to enhance this employability of students and to make them placement ready. Dr. Shabnam is passionate about English language and literature. She has published many research papers, and she has given many presentations on both national and international platforms. Currently, she is working as adjunct faculty, business communication in VGIM, Vignana Jyoti Institute of Management, Hyderabad, and guest faculty for communication skill in the Fashion Management Department of National Institute of Fashion Technology, Hyderabad. So, welcome, Dr. Manna, madam. I request.
Thank you, Priyanka. Thank you so much. And am I audible? I just did a voice check earlier, but am I audible for?
Yes.
Sir, good. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Priyanka. And a very good evening to all the academicians, students, research scholars, and teachers who have sacrificed their Saturday evening and who have connected with each other for another, knowledge-packed and information-laden session organized by iSPELL India. I extend a very warm welcome to all of you to this e-seminar on Bleeding Histories and Healing Wounds, Trauma as Writing. I extend a very special welcome to Dr. Prantik Banerjee, the resource person and the chief speaker of today's session. So we are honored and privileged by your presence here today. I also extend a very warm welcome to Dr. T.R. Murthy Krishnan, who would be chairing today's session. Sir, we are honored by your gracious presence on the chair for today's session. Thank you, sir, for being here today. Well, ladies and gentlemen, as we are all aware that iSPELL was formed with the single motto of bringing or providing a common platform to the learners and practitioners of English. And the motto of the society is, as just told, facilitate to elevate. And it gives me immense pleasure and it gives me immense happiness to say that this society, despite the fact that it's a very nascent society, it was just formed last year, has fulfilled its mission and its vision, and like how. If we look back into the past months, the society has organized seminars, webinars, and workshops in the areas of English language, literature, ELT, translation studies, gender studies, research methodology. The list is endless. I congratulate Team iSPELL and also the core committee of iSPELL for this commendable work. But as they always say, every ship needs a captain. And I salute the captain of this ship, Dr. G.A. Ghanshyam. Sir, it is your energy, your exuberance, your vigor that keeps this vessel kinetic and afloat. So I can. And if the motto of the society is to facilitate and elevate, I think you share a motto with Ulysses to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. So thank you for actually doing such commendable work in the area of language and literature, iSPELL. Ladies and gentlemen, the topic of today's session and today's seminar is indeed very, very provoking, very poignant, I must say. Bleeding Histories and Healing Wounds, Trauma in Writing. Trauma is a universal theme that has been occurring in literatures of all ages and all times. But ironically, this is still a very uncharted area. There is very little information that we have on this particular domain, and it gives us immense privilege, and we feel very proud and honored that we have a scholar of the repute of Dr. Prantik Banerjee, who would be delivering a talk on this area. Dr. Banerjee needs no introduction, but I take this as a matter of pride and privilege to formally introduce Dr. Prantik Banerjee to all of you. Dr. Banerjee is an associate professor in the Department of English in Hislop College, Nagpur. Post-colonial studies, trauma theories, and disability studies. He's also interested in higher education policies, quality assurance frameworks, and curriculum design. He's a keynote speaker and resource person at several international and national conferences. An expert, IQA supervisor, and has conducted many training programs for colleges and universities in India. Prantik Banerjee is a certified HRD trainer from TPS Bengaluru and has conducted several teacher and corporate training programs. His publications include 3 book chapters, 38 research papers in peer-reviewed journals. He is on the editorial board of several international and national journals on higher education, as well as English studies. Dr. Banerjee is a published poet and a short story writer. In fact, he was featured as the poet of the fortnight by the renowned poetess Kamla Das. His articles have been published by leading newspapers like the Times of India, Hitwat, and the Caravan. Dr. Banerjee, on behalf of iSPELL, I again welcome you to this forum, and I request you and I invite you to deliver your talk on the topic of today's session. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kamla Das. And
There is some voice at your end, sir.
The static at your end, sir. I think there is a clash with some other device.
I think you have 2 devices at the same place.
well, my mobile, okay, just a minute. Now, is it clear? Am I clear?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Right. First of all, a big thank you to Dr. Ghanshyam. He and I, Dr. Ghanshyam has been quite a visible face. He and I have crossed paths on many conferences and seminars where the city of Nagpur and even Hislop has played host. He's also a regular member in our PhD Viva sessions. And so he and I go a long way, and it's always a pleasure to connect with him. It's always a pleasure to associate with him. I was not aware of iSPELL until he, some time back, WhatsApped me saying that this is a forum which has been recently formed in order to promote and engage with literary and academic activities for the betterment of not just students and research scholars, but for the teaching fraternity on the whole. So thank you so much, Dr. Ghanshyam, for inviting me to today's virtual meet. Thank you also, or rather good evening, and thank you to Dr. Jyoti Patil, the president. I'm not sure about the office positions, but I'm told, I'm sure you are a key holder, and maybe the president or the vice president. Sorry if I goofed up on the designation, but
she is wisely designated president.
Okay. So great to connect with Dr. Jyoti Patil. And I was just asking her whether she's cut down on our morning walks, because normally we would often cross each other on our morning walks. Also, thank you, Dr. Murali Krishnan, for being the chairperson of the meet, and also Priyanka Sharma, isn't it, who introduced or who is the moderator, or the no, not moderator, but the master.
Dr. Shabnam Das is the master of ceremony.
Master of ceremony. All right. Okay. So this is typically a sign of an absent-minded professor, and I do trip up on positions and designations very often, much to the embarrassment of the organizers. So forgive me if I've tripped on a couple of labels and designations.
Sir, excuse me, can you increase your volume a little bit? We are getting messages in the chat box.
It's all
okay. Can you keep that the headphone one near to your mouth? Yeah. If it will increase. Yeah.
All right. Okay. Yeah. So a very warm good evening, and when I say warm good evening, I was talking to Dr. Murli, and he was telling me about how at his place there's been a thunderstorm, and uh, so I much envy him, and I was telling him to blow the winds in the right direction, in our direction as well. In the midst of pandemic, if iSPELL has been an organization that has been, that has been birthed by a team of inspirational leaders such as Dr. Ghansham and Dr. Patil, then kudos to them, really, for taking off in such stressful times as these are turning out to be. Kudos to them that they have started something where, those of us who are interested, who wish to engage, and who are enthusiastic and eagerly waiting to keep ourselves abreast with the latest reads, the latest good reads, and what's happening generally in the world of literature and language. This platform, I'm sure, has already rendered a yeoman service. And although it might have taken baby steps just about 8 months from now, but I'm sure it's going to very soon take giant strides. So with my best wishes to iSPELL, I suppose the first thing I can do, and this is again a moment of digital stress, let me share my screen with you. Hope the host will allow me to share my screen.
Yes, sir. It's visible.
Okay, now that we have taken care of one more tipping point, we all are experiencing various kinds of trauma, and well, some of a severe degree and some of a lesser degree. And one of the traumatic moments is really where internet protocols are going to enable us to, to have all our systems checked down. And particularly for the resource person or the speaker of the day, sharing one screen becomes that tipping moment, that one little minute where you are on 10 hooks, you're walking on eggshells, whether you're going to succeed in sharing your screen or not. And believe me, there have been many a webinar now between last year and this year where things have really tripped up then the tipping point. Friends, I have made, when I spoke to Dr. Ghansham, and I said, and I also gave him the title of my talk, I've made a slight modification. And so the title of my talk today is Bleeding Histories and Healing Stories, the Trauma of Fathers and Sons. The trauma of fathers and sons. And so let me plunge straight into my talk. And I think this is something that you would all recognize and be familiar with, both as if you're an English teacher and if you are, if you're teaching Elizabethan drama or Shakespearean drama, or if you're a research scholar or even a student. Conventionally, when we, it is a truth universally acknowledged that Shakespeare's Hamlet is interpreted and engaged with as a tragedy of revenge. So whether it is A.C. Bradley, when we talk about the traditional critics, and I go back to the 1920s and 30s, so whether we are talking about liberal humanist critics such as A.C. Bradley to W. Hilliard, or to more contemporary critics such as Clem Brooks, the traditional way of reading this play has been that that Shakespeare's Hamlet is predominantly a tragedy of revenge. Hamlet, however, if you read the play in a slightly different way, when the play opens, we do remember that Hamlet is already traumatized by the death of his father and his mother's quick remarriage to his uncle Claudius. So his trauma is essentially because of two reasons. One, because on account of the loss of his father, and the hasty marriage of his mother to his uncle. And in Act 1, if you remember, Act 1, I think it is scene 5, He is so severely traumatized. He's also traumatized by his father's ghost, or rather by the ghost's recollection of a murderous past, and where the ghost and when the ghost appears before him, he says, Hamlet says, "I, thou poor, whilst memory holds a seat in this distracted globe." Uh, when we meet Hamlet in the first act itself, he appears to be very a confused prince, because not only has he lost his father, remember, but he also is not sure if his uncle killed his father, as he has strong suspicions of doing so. The interesting thing about this play is that uh, while conventional reading of the play treat it as a tragedy of revenge, as I said, the play also invites alternate readings. And in that sense, you might look at Shakespeare's Hamlet as an exploration of the transmission of intergenerational trauma in more ways than one. And I will very soon define what I mean by intergenerational trauma. What I do want you to remember is that at the time of writing Hamlet, well, Shakespeare had lost his son. He had, he was going through a personal crisis on two counts. One, he had lost his son Hamlet, and his father John too was dying. So, in a sense, in our alternative reading of Hamlet, we may consider the play as a sort of a symbolic working through of a personal crisis of Shakespeare, as a sort of a cathartic writing by Shakespeare, uh, um, who's trying to come to grips with the loss of both father and son. So, from the point of view of trauma, therefore, Hamlet may not be read just as a tragedy of revenge, but one may read it as a tragedy of trauma. And the play, therefore, may be reread as the displacement and transmutation of a personal trauma in which Shakespeare is trying to do what his fictional character, Hamlet, the Prince of Denmark, is told by the ghost of his father. Once again, what is what is Hamlet told by his father's ghost? He's told to remember and to speak. He's told to remember and to speak, for otherwise, his dead father says, or the ghost says, I am thy father's spirit. I am thy father's spirit, doomed for a certain term to walk the night. But what Hamlet's father tells him, to remember and to speak, is actually the double dilemma, or a double injunction when one experiences trauma. In the context of the play, if murder, friends, if murder causes trauma, and trauma essentially is about unspeakable things that are so terrible, things that are so horrible. And so if trauma is about unspeakable things, then to speak, the double injunction is that we are confronted with a situation where to speak is impossible, but not to speak is also impossible. And therefore, the dilemma of both Shakespeare as well as his character Hamlet symbolize, according to me, the double bind of trauma. To speak is impossible, but not to speak is equally impossible. And if you really think about, the trauma of fathers and sons, whether the trauma of fathers and sons is one of the predominant tropes or one of the major themes of literature, then you only have to look not only at Shakespeare's Hamlet, but Shakespeare's Hamlet joins the ranks of other classics, only classics, and I'm talking only of classics. For example, Joyce's Ulysses and Homer's Odyssey. All these three works, in fact, deal with the trauma of fathers and sons, and the trauma also is intergenerational. So My opening premise of my talk is that stories such as Hamlet, pieces of work, pieces of literature such as Hamlet, Joyce's Ulysses, Homer's Odyssey, all of these are not only stories about the fraught relationships of fathers and sons, but also stories about intergenerational or generational trauma. So what do I mean by generational or intergenerational trauma? You know, generational trauma is exactly what it sounds like. Trauma that isn't just experienced by one person, but trauma that is experienced by a family, by a community, and one that extends from one generation to the next, a trauma that is passed on, whose legacy, whose impact, and whose deep ridden crisis is passed from one generation, is handed over from one generation to the next. One only has to take a look at fiction, which gives us several heartrending narratives on the subject of trauma as intergenerational trauma, trauma that is collective, trauma that is handed over, trauma that is passed over from one generation to the next, that is successive generations. Now, you can think of several popular works dealing with intergenerational trauma, but then these representations of generational or intergenerational trauma in works of fiction have been accounted for by a large number of factors. A trauma, no single reason or no single cause is the effective reason for causing trauma. In fact, fictional representations of intergenerational or generational trauma very often trauma that is suffered by a group or a community, and one that is triggered by a cataclysmic event or a disastrous episode in their personal history. And the reasons, therefore, that we see in popular literature, the reasons for generational or intergenerational trauma could be because of a host of factors. So, for example, on your slide, think about Alex Haley's Roots, for instance, which deals with slavery as a cause of intergenerational trauma. Roots, as we all know, fabulous, a fantastic story, one of the classics now, which came out in the 1970s by Alex Haley, tracing the epic journey, tracing the epic story of Kunta Kinte, its chief characteristic, who's turned into a captive, bound and turned into a slave, and transported in a galley ship to North America. And so Roots is all about the great grandson of Kunta Kinte. It is partly autobiographical. The great grandson, Alex Haley, who traces the roots of his own family, going all the way back to his great grandfather, whom he casts as a fictional character as Kunta Kinte, and tracing that epic and sordid saga of turning his family into a slave. When you think of what war has been one of the most primary reasons for causing trauma, and trauma that has been suffered not only by soldiers who have participated in the war, but trauma that has left deep-seated, deep scars and emotional and caused psychological maladjustment in successive generations, even the children, for example, of soldiers. And you have this wonderful representation of in what is called as the Regeneration Trilogy by Pat Barker. Well, these are some of, the third book that is listed on your slide is one that deals with Toni Morrison's Beloved, which deals with the trauma of domestic violence and sexual abuse. The point that I'm trying to make, friends, here is that trauma has had a variety of reasons, events and episodes that are disastrous, that alter the identity and the fate and destiny of many a group and many a community, can be caused by a large number of reasons, three of which I just listed. However, in my talk, the focus of my talk is, you know, I would like to narrow it down to one specific kind of trauma, not just intergenerational trauma, not just trauma of fathers and sons, but also trauma which I would like to locate or situate in the context of what I call historical trauma. You know, everyone, everyone is susceptible to what is called generational trauma, but there are specific populations that history bears witness, that there are specific populations, specific communities of particular race, of particular ethnicity, of particular religions that have been more prone and vulnerable to traumatic experience due to their unique histories. I mean, we only have to look at partition literature and think about the refugees of partition and their children on either side of the borders of the Indian subcontinent, and we find that what uh, partition literature deals with has been the trauma of one more kind of violence, and that is communal violence. And violence, violence not only about the riots that broke out, but also violence whose psychological effects, violence that cause psychological, enormous psychological damage to successive generations. Friends, one type, therefore, of intergenerational trauma is the focus of my talk, and that is historical trauma. And historical trauma, like I said, is intergenerational trauma that is experienced by a specific community, by a specific cultural group that has a history of being systematically such trauma, the events that episodes that cause trauma, the locations in history, excuse me, that cause such trauma are not just particular and unique, but something, that has happened over a period of time and sometimes has been experienced in many locations. Take, for example, so what would be those sub-communities? For example, blacks, what we call blacks or Afro-Americans now, the trauma of Red Indians, the trauma of Aboriginal tribes, the trauma of Jews, and so on. I mean, you can think of many such whose particular and unique experience of trauma is what I call historical trauma. In fact, historical trauma is a term that was coined by, Maria Yellow Horse Braveheart, a Native American social worker, and in the 1980s. And Braveheart defines historical trauma. The definition is there on the slide. That she defines it as a cumulative emotional and psychological wounding that takes place over the lifespan and across generations, emanating from massive group trauma. So notice that her definition, in fact, very succinctly encapsulates the three major characteristics that I attributed in my introduction to intergenerational historical trauma. Number one that is cumulative. She calls it a cumulative emotional and psychological wounding, which means we are not here talking. Historical trauma is not the trauma of individual, of one person or individuals. It is collective trauma. It is trauma that is experienced by a group or a community or even a race. Second, it takes place over a period of time, lifespan, and it is passed on from one generation to another. And she says emanating from massive group trauma. And just because, also the effective, or rather the effect of this trauma does not dilute, does not diminish with the passage of time. That is to say, according to Braveheart, she demonstrates that trauma continues to have the same kind of physiological and psychological damage that that was originally experienced by people placed in that moment, in the original moment of trauma, but it is also experienced equally by successive generations. What comes to my mind immediately, even as I'm recounting this definition, is that the history of mankind bears witness to the violence of war, the violence of racism, the violence of internecine warfare, the violence of, or even the trauma caused by poverty. All of these things are traumatic enough not only to cause physiological damages, but also enormous psychological disorders within a particular community. Think, and I'm reminded here of, scientific studies that uh, continue to examine the long-standing or the long-term effect of the atom bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And these scientific studies reveal something shocking, and that is that the trauma of of the of the bombarding of Hiroshima and Nagasaki continues to continues to have genetic mutations among children. Same is the case of the history of African Americans, or the history of the racism and slavery of African Americans in the United States. Think about, right from a fictional book such as Roots, which is partly autobiographical by Alex Haley, to today's times where we talk about Black Lives Matter. All of them are evidence of a particular community, of a particular race suffering over a long period of time, for more than 2 centuries, the same psychological and physiological damage caused by trauma. In this case, trauma caused by slavery and racism. Friends, in our own time, something similar might happen as a result of the ongoing pandemic, the COVID-19 crisis. And I suspect that this pandemic, as we have been discussing, before the start of today's program, uh, might leave deep emotional scars and cause permanent psychological maladjustments for us and for our children. Who would have thought that among the many medical categories of trauma, we would also add in our own times a new kind of trauma, pandemic trauma. And pandemic trauma, I have reason to believe, might also be historical, might also be classified as historical and intergenerational. It might also be a trauma of fathers and sons. So historical trauma, then, friends, has a tremendous impact on the psychological and the physical health of those who experience it, of those who are caught in the middle of a cataclysmic event. It is also cumulative and it reverberates across generations. Those of us who have, followed um, the pathways, the many pathways of theory, particularly postmodern theory, if to quickly place trauma studies in in its own historical context. Well, trauma studies emerged in the humanities, you know, with an ethical turn in humanities, what is called as an ethical turn in humanities, which took place in the late 1980s and the early 1990s. And remember, we're talking about a timeline where in the 1990s, post-structuralism, that was the high watermark of, let's say, post-structuralism and postmodernism. But by the 1990s, we also know that there were there was a crisis in not just in literature, but a crisis in theory. And and I'm sure you have heard about the theory wars. And so people like Lacan, Derrida, Foucault, Lyotard, all of this, the high priests and the proponents of postmodern theory, were coming under the scanner, and primarily because in their writings, many of the opponents of these critics had a problem. They're finding a problem with their kind of reading of literature and their theories about literature. Primarily, their objection found with their overemphasis on the free play of science and the semantic deconstruction. Many critics, many theorists found in the writings of Michel Foucault or Derrida or a Lyotard something that was ethically disturbing. I mean, the interest of the postmodernists and the post-structuralists, with their emphasis on fluxes, slippages, ambiguities, ambivalences, and indeterminacy. All of these seem to repudiate, uh, uh, even the possibility of having faith in values, uh, human values. And many of the opponents, therefore, in the 1990s, especially the new wave of critics, not the new critics, but the new theorists who emerged after postmodernism, were sort of arguing that the postmodern and the post-structural model of reading and engaging with literature was undermining the ethical dimension of literature. So, so one of the main arguments that the opponents of post-structuralism and postmodernism was that the post-structuralists seem to be, in their business of there seemed to be um, mm, an all-out assault launched by the post-structuralists on the autonomy of the human subject, leading to the so-called death of man, or what you might call in simple terms, what you might understand in simple terms as the destruction or decentering of the human subject in a decentered universe. For after all, that has been the locus point of all deconstruction or post-structuralism. And in the process of, therefore, the assault launched by the post-structuralists and the postmodernists on the human subject, on the individual subject that we call man, they seem to be rejecting the possibility of human agency on which ethical choice and action itself depended. What you see on the slide shows to you one crucial moment that signaled the beginning of a ethical turn and the return of historicism within the larger frame of trauma studies. This singular moment is what has been called, unfortunately, as the Paul de Man affair, or the de Man affair, and the death of man. Remember, Paul de Man, in the 1980s, was considered one of the high priests of post-structuralism. An anti-Semite, a Jew hater. And it was revealed that as a young man in Nazi-occupied, when he was young, he was living in Nazi-occupied Belgium. Paul de Man had written numerous articles that indicated support of Nazism and fascist ideology. And so he stood accused of anti-Semitism posthumously after his death. And so this not only gave rise to theory wars, but there was a lot of image tarnishing of de Man. Major figures, as particularly the new writers who burst on the scene, such as Shoshana Feldman, Frederick Jameson, Barbara Johnson, and Derrida himself struggled to come to terms with these new revelations that came to the fore about Paul de Man and his anti-Semitism. And in the wake of these findings, de Man's work, and also de Man's work as an individual, as a theoretician, as a postmodernist and post-structuralist, as well as deconstruction as his methodological tool, began to be dismissed wholesale. The books such as The Double Life of Paul de Man came out, and the quote, "The whole of deconstruction is a vast and nasty project for the politics of collaboration during World War II." Both the book as well as this quote by Jeffrey Melman points out to the kind of the politics of anti-Semitism that was being played out. So this rather sordid turn of events in the de Man affair prompted a new critic, a new theorist, who will eventually be called a trauma theorist, Dominic Lacapra. And it was Dominic Lacapra, now regarded, now considered a prominent trauma theorist, who wrote that there was a need in critical the participants to mute. There is, thank you. So it was Dominic Lacapra who pointed out that there was a need in critical theory for an explicitly ethical turn. By then, by the late 1990s, new critical writings emerged which turned away from post-structuralism and postmodernism and began to engage with what we call an ethical turn in the humanities. And the result is these three books that you see on your slide. These are considered the foundational texts or the foundational works on trauma studies. Soshana Fellman and Doylov's testimony, crisis of witnessing in literature, psychoanalysis and history. Dominic Lacapra's representing the Holocaust, history, theory, and trauma, and Kathy Carruth's unclaimed experience, trauma, narrative, and history. Friends, all of these books came out in the 1990s, from the period between 1992 to 1996. And you know what? The fascinating thing about these three books is that all contain chapters devoted largely or wholly to Paul de Man, making it clear that it was the demand affair that provided to them the immediate intellectual context and for writing their book and for also giving to theory an ethical turnaround. To an important degree, therefore, trauma theory may be considered primarily as a response to the challenge of reading literature after Paul de Man. The other striking thing, if you notice, the other striking thing about these three foundational works of trauma studies is this, that they all have history in their subtitles. And they all contain substantial discussions of the Holocaust and its historical trauma. So one might say that trauma studies in its modern form came into being, at least in part, I would say, through the encounter between Holocaust studies on the one hand and a counter reading practice, or a reading practice that came in the 1990s as a counter move against the prevailing post-structuralist practices of writing and reading. The underlying justification of this ethical turn to humanities was that ethics was back. Theorists wanted ethics to be very much part of the humanities. Friends, we all know that the relationship between historical events and trauma literature is an intrinsic one. It is a symbiotic one. What is evident is that, whenever a traumatic event happens, it kind of challenges its representation by writers, artists, to understand and interpret the event itself, such as was the case with the Holocaust, or such as was the case with 9/11 that you see on your slide. The problem that artists face in their response, in an ethical response, in an ethical and aesthetic response to trauma, is this, that the very nature of its violence seems to render language ineffable. It seems impossible, or rather writers struggle then to imaginatively reconstruct an event which has a world-altering consequence, an event that is so terrible in its impact that it creates a crisis over large masses of populations. Because when a conflict of terrible proportion happens, not only does it alter the reality of the time, but it also makes demands on language. Language has to be then stretched to accommodate a new reality. New meanings and new idiom, new neologisms have to be coined to reflect a new condition. For example, when 9/11 happened, 9/11 made writers ask, what verb should one use for parking a plane in a building? So we come to a central dilemma between trauma and its representation in fiction or its representation in art. The ethics of aesthetics and the politics of aesthetics. We all know how complex the process is for art to capture and make meaning of events that are horrific and that are far-flung in the repercussions. And it was Theodor Adorno who said that to write poetry after Auschwitz would be barbaric. He thought what he meant was that that it would be unethical, it would be immoral to even for artists to even try to capture the pain and suffering of the millions who had died in the concentration camps and the Nazi gas chambers. Of course, before he died in 1969, Adorno did retract his remark, conceding the quote on your slide, the bottom of your slide, conceding that suffering has as much right to be represented as a martyr has to cry out. So it may have been false to say after Auschwitz is impossible. If you look closely at what Adorno, the two statements of Adorno, is the substitution of the word barbaric with the word impossible seems to suggest that the danger for Adorno was not in writing about disaster, that the danger for Adorno was not in the writing of a writer about the disaster of Holocaust, but in the pretense of understanding it. For to recreate a human tragedy in word, paint, or image is to expose the artist to the charge of inhuman appropriation. This alone, friends, can expose the artist to the charge of doing grave injustice to the victims who have actually suffered, whether it is the Holocaust or 9/11. Because after all, you will agree with me that no one wants, war or disaster. No one wants trauma and terror to be misrepresented, to be politicized, to be co-opted, or to be distorted. So if we ask ourselves the dilemma of the artist, can the artist make art in a time of atrocity? Can creativity make up for conflict? Can the imagination capture the actual horror of collapsing skyscrapers or of the pile of burnt bodies, charred and scarred to death in the gas chambers of Auschwitz? If we ask ourselves, can art in general and literature in particular capture that which is inconceivable, incomprehensible? It's a very question. It's a very, very difficult problem. And there are no easy answers to that. After 9/11, British novelist Martin Amis commented, he said, I think every writer on earth was considering a change of occupation on September 12th. Because what the writer had to say would be so dwarfed by the events that took place. And our own V.S. Naipaul even more daringly declared the death of the novel. So are we saying therefore that poetry and fiction that art in general, art about atrocity, to create art about atrocity is to reduce the irreducible to the familiar. But then, you know, it opens another question. It raises another question. Are we saying, therefore, that in order to write about traumatic events, writers must first create a language that can be truthful to the event, language where nothing can be figurative, because to turn the suffering and misery, the terror and the horror of a Holocaust victim into a metaphor or to a symbol would, for people like Adorno, be unpardonable. So it must artists, therefore, must writers, therefore, first invent, first create a language appropriate to the enormity of the crime or the enormity of the trauma before even representing it in fiction or poetry. But to say that, you know, we may even, I mean, I'm playing the devil's advocate. But even to argue against this particular position is to suggest that, you know, are we saying, therefore, that art about atrocity cannot be figurative? Because then we can always say that, you know, to avoid, if art avoids the risk of speaking, then isn't art therefore going to canonize silence? This tension, therefore, between art and trauma is actually the double bind of trauma that I referred to earlier with Hamlet's example. To speak is impossible, and not to speak is equally impossible. If trauma, therefore, is about unspeakable things, and the Holocaust, therefore, is the supremest example of things that are of an event or an episode that is so terrible and so horrific in its nature that one would not think of creating art. But can the Holocaust, can trauma in general and the Holocaust be depicted in the form of comics? So when we think of comics, we think of funnies, isn't it? We don't even, conventionally, we don't even think of comic as a literary form. So if we begin asking, can trauma be depicted? Can the Holocaust be depicted in the form of comics? Perhaps many of you would be surprised. Some might even be shocked or traumatized. Can something, therefore, as I said, as horrific as the Holocaust be represented in a comic form, in a graphic narrative? Well, Art Spiegelman, what you have on the slide, clearly says yes, it can. Art Spiegelman's Mouse, A Survivor's Tale, is one of the most influential books, friends, influential works in contemporary fiction about the Holocaust. And incredibly, it's been written in comic book form. Like I said, one tends to think that, you know, for such a grim and serious subject as the Holocaust, the comic form would be most unsuitable, inappropriate, or even unethical. But Spiegelman's Mouse has proved that the iconic language, the iconical language, by that I mean the visual language of graphic novels can be suitable for any topic on par with any other kind of conventional literary writing. Friends, Mouse is a historical record of Holocaust. It is a personal memoir. And it is also a survivor's tale. It has proved to be one of the greatest graphic novels of all times. Spiegelman created Mouse to record his father and his family's survival from Auschwitz. He also wrote Mouse in order to sort of memorialize the deaths of nearly 7 million Jews whom a pogrom that Hitler called the final solution. Actually, Mouse is a record of 3 kinds of traumatic experiences. One, Art Spiegelman's father's suffering, because remember, it's a book that recounts his father's survival, his father's suffering and survival in the concentration camps of Auschwitz and Belsen. So it's the first kind of traumatic experience is that of his father's. The second is Spiegelman's own experiences as the son of a survivor. Something that when I talked about intergenerational trauma, the trauma of a horrific event passed by, or not only the memory, but the trauma of a horrific event passed from father to son. And third, the third traumatic experience captured by Maus is Spiegelman's own experience while writing about the experience of being the son of a survivor. What a demanding task, you can say. Indeed, like Shakespeare's Hamlet, Joyce's Ulysses, and Homer's Odyssey, one can read Spiegelman's Maus as the depiction of the trauma of fathers and sons. Furthermore, like the earlier stories, Maus too is a story of intergenerational or generational trauma. In this particular comic, Spiegelman draws human characters as mice and cats, and you would obviously immediately be reminded of George Orwell's Animal Farm. I don't really have the time, we don't have the time to go into the symbolism of this animal anthropomorphism. In the comic, Spiegelman shows the Jews as mice, the Germans as predatory cats, the Poles are pigs, the Swedes are deer with horns, the Americans are dogs, and the gypsy is a butterfly. So, like I said, I could go into a discussion on the symbolism if I had the time. But clearly, his portraying Jews as mice was a barbed response, is a barbed response to Hitler's statement, as you see on the bottom of your slide, that the Jews are undoubtedly a race, but they are not human, said Hitler. So Spiegelman's Spiegelman's feline Nazis remind us that the Germans' brutality was at bottom no more explicable than the savagery of cats toying with their prey, that is the mice. Maus is written in two parts. My Father Bleeds History, a survivor's tale. The first part is My Father Bleeds History, and the second part, And Here My Troubles Began. And the story of Maus, the writing of Spiegelman's writing of Maus itself is an epic story, because it started out as a literary project, but in the 1980s. But then it became a literary project that eventually took him 13 years to complete. Spiegelman's first approach to his father's testimony on the Holocaust was published as a short story in an underground comic book. Subsequently, between 1980 and 1991, he developed it into a full-length book having 2 volumes and one, which went on to win the Pulitzer Prize. And funnily, call it funnily or comically, the year, I don't remember, the year that Maus won the Pulitzer Prize, but that year, the Pulitzer Prize jury had to actually make a new category because they didn't really know whether Spiegelman's Maus could be called literature. So what they did, in the absence of a category for this novel and highly innovative style of writing, comic writing, they had to invent a category which they called special category and awarded the Pulitzer Prize to Spiegelman. Praised by critics and readers alike, friends, the work's influence, Spiegelman's Maus has cascaded into other fields, becoming the subject of critical analysis, as well as not only in literature, but in history, in social history as well. And it has become the source It has become a source for exhibitions in museums and art galleries. So it has had a wide-ranging effect. I can only point out one of the unique styles that makes Spiegelman's Mouse a landmark book. A landmark book not only as a piece of literature, but a landmark book in in representing the historical trauma of Holocaust. As you can see on the panel that I put on the slide, this is an example of what Spiegelman calls testimonial writing. And this is a testimonial writing where the technique that he employs is what he calls visual textimony, textimony. Now, if you look at that, if you look at this panel is actually a page, you know, not this, sorry, this one, yeah. This is one page. The panel that you see is one page of Spiegelman's Mouse. And to show you how the narrative works, and why is it called visual testimony, look at this panel. This is on page 13 of the book. And what it shows, if you look at the panels carefully, panels meaning, panel in comic book, the art form, the technique, where you see the boxes, they're called panels. And the white space is called the gutter. And notice also, therefore, immediately that the comic Spiegelman chose to draw this book in black and white. And I think you might guess the reason, because remember Steven Spielberg's film, Oscar-winning film, Schindler's List, which also is a Holocaust film. And there too, the film was made in black and white. So, let me give you an instance of Spiegelman's unique technique, which he calls testimony here. Take the panel, and every panel on the page you will see anticipates and defines the complete story of the trauma of Holocaust as experienced by a character, by his father, a character whom he calls Vladik, and its intergenerational effect on his son, again, the fictional son called Artie in the comic, as well as the creator, Spiegelman himself. The first obvious thing that you would notice is the mouse metaphor that is employed in this text. And all the characters are anthropomorphic mice here. However, you would also quickly notice that neither their language, gesture, clothes, nor even the depiction of home in the panels suggest that they are mice. Another thing that you might notice is the autobiographical dimension to this comic, to the comic narrative, to this visual testimony, because the very first line says, I hadn't seen him. I went out to see my father in the Rego Park. I hadn't seen him in a long time. The narrative voice in the caption itself captures immediately the immediacy of a personal, intimate, and confessional voice, which is autobiography. It also, the panel also, the last panel of the page where the reader is informed that Artie and Vladek, his father, had not seen each other for nearly two years. And this points out to the troubled relationship that trauma has caused between the father and son. And the fourth panel displayed on the slide actually zooms in onto the core subject of the book, the Holocaust and its recollections. Artie's parents, his father, stepmother, Mala, and most of their friends, as shown in this single panel on your slide, are all Holocaust survivors. They all went through and survived the death camps in Auschwitz, Birkenau, Dachau, and now after the war, they ended up reunited in Rego Park in the United States. So in a metonymic sense, these figures, these cartoons, these figures become representatives of the testimonies of other survivors who went through the same horror. What is also important is, the mice figure, as I've already said, are visual symbols of Hitler's view about Jews. And the cartoon figure of the author is there right in the panel, wearing a black coat and a white shirt, that in a paradoxical way stereotypes the image of an Orthodox Jew. The entire narrative in the comic is non-linear. And in this panel alone, every element from the past is here, interconnected and linked with the present. Artie's relation with his father, his parents' damaging marriage, Vladek's uncompromising behavior, Anja, Artie's mother's suicide, their Polish background, their Jewish history, the death camp and the war, all of these the reader is called upon by the panel to apprehend all together and simultaneously, what, in a manner which I'm reminded of what Walter Benjamin calls a constellation of memories. A constellation of memories, according to Walter Benjamin, is about the simultaneity of the past in the present, that the past coincides with the present to such an extent that the past achieves a now of its recognizability. So this, friends, is what Spiegelman's technique, the technique that he employs of visual testimony. And this is something that he does consistently throughout the comic book. Post-memory, this is again one of the key terms in trauma studies, and it's a term that's being formulated by one of the trauma theorists named Marian Hirsch. This has become an influential key word in trauma studies, and post-memory typically describes the relationship of children of survivors of collective trauma to the experience of their parents. Experiences that these children remember only as the narratives and images with which they grew up. For example, if you've had your own grandparents as refugees or people who crossed over during the time of the partition, I did, my grandparents or my maternal grandparents fled their homes, their ancestral villages in Bangladesh, now Bangladesh, during the partition, and came to India, came to West Bengal. And I still remember, therefore, my father recounting the trauma, my mother rather, recounting the trauma of her parents during that long journey, during the dislocation and the uprooting that took place. So in the midst of fear, in the midst of these stories become, stories that are carried forward, that are passed on from one generation to the next. And these stories, therefore, the trauma of these stories or the trauma of these memories are so monumental that Marian Hirsch calls them familial inheritance. Post-memory is a sort of a familial inheritance, like the kind of family heirlooms that you inherit. Well, this also comes as part of the rite of passage. So post-memory then is not only, I would say, familial inheritance, one that is passed from one generation. It is collective trauma, it is collective memory, it is collective trauma, and it is historical trauma. And Spiegelman's mouse then is a perfect illustration of Hirsch's concept of post-memory, because, its narrative not only shows the terrible experiences of the Holocaust suffered by Vladek, the fictional character, the father figure in the comic, but it also remembers the way in which this trauma is remembered by the fictional son Artie, and by extension, the creator of the fictional father and the fictional son, that is Art Spiegelman. More importantly, Mouse is post-memory because, because Artie's individual reception of his father's historical experience of the Holocaust enables him to participate in the collective remembrance of a race, the Jews. So the memories of the father and the collective remembrance of the Jewish experience turn into post-memory. And post-memory becomes a sort of a retrospective witnessing by adoption. As Hirsch defines post-memory, which is there on the slide, he says, post-memory is adopting the traumatic experiences and thus also the memories of others as experiences one might oneself have had, and of inscribing them into one's own life story. Friends, this is what I wanted my title to mean, that post-memory is a bleeding of history into story. And what Mouse, therefore, does as a graphic novel, call it a graphic novel, call it a graphic narrative or a comic, what it does is that in the representation of such a traumatic and terrible historical event, it pushes the boundaries between fiction and non-fiction, between testimony and testimony. To me, it appears that Spiegelman, in the writing of Mouse, problematizes the categorical distinctions between the language of icons and the language of words, between comic books and history books, between the written transcription and the drawn graphic novel. And therefore, I consider Mouse to be an exemplary illustration of what I call a performative testimony, a text that performs, a text that not only narrates, but it performs the trauma of the Holocaust. So, to the original question that I had posed in one of the previous slides, can art create atrocity? Can a comic recapture the horror of the Holocaust? Well, Spiegelman's Mouse demonstrates that the representation of Shoah is possible even in a comic book form. The book shows that through a technique which visual testimony, it brings together a complex constellation of memories from the past and memories that are relived, remembered in the present. And so the trauma of the Holocaust is effectively transmitted to the community from a writer of Jewish origin to the community of we readers. And yet, trauma literature at its core remains paradoxical. At its core, it fundamentally is paradoxical because literary trauma texts, always try to do the unthinkable, to communicate that which resists remembering and narrating. Trauma narratives, both in the past as well as in the future, including the one that I said, pandemic narratives or pandemic trauma narratives, will relentlessly raise important questions about the possibility of speaking the unspeakable and narrating the unnarratable. But the history of writing bears witness to the fact that exceptional fiction, exceptional trauma narratives, such as Spiegelman's Mouse, will brilliantly succeed in performing this complex balancing act between the unspeakability and unnarratability of trauma, as well as the ethics and the ethicality of narratives. Friends, all that I can say in passing is that trauma writings, whether it is in painting or rather traumatic art, whether it is in the form of painting, sculpture, monuments, or in the form of any narrative, essentially its purpose is driven by a burning desire to turn wound into words. And trauma narratives, therefore, I feel can never have endings. Because they are intergenerational, they can never have closures. Such writings, like Hamlet's ghost, can only revisit trauma as a haunting. So all that trauma narratives can do, and they try to do, is to turn living wounds into writing scars. And they do this by healing wounds with leading stories. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir, and thank you so much. And you were actually hoping for a thunderstorm in Nagpur, but it's actually you who have created a thunderstorm on this forum by your thunderous talk on trauma writing, sir. And I'm sure you were busy talking and you were not able to take a peep into the chat box, and it's been flooded with, you know, words like a deeply researched paper, a wonderful talk, and an excellent and insightful presentation. And I can't agree more with what listeners say. Excellent deliberation, sir, and wonderful talk. And we are all aware that trauma writing is a relatively unknown genre. It's not being taught so vigorously in the curriculum. It's a relatively unknown genre to both the teachers and practitioners of literature. But thank you for introducing this genre to us, sir. And I'm sure it has ignited many a minds. And post your talk, I'm sure there are going to be a lot of research papers, a lot of dissertations, and also theses in this area. Thank you, and a very thought-provoking presentation. I'm sure we are burning with the desire to ask you questions. I have a couple of questions with me, a few that have been asked in the chat box. I would be reading that first, and the forum is open for questions. Any questions or maybe any remarks that you would like to share are more than welcome. But before that, I would just like to read a question posted by Dr. Indrani in the chat box. How authentic it is to accept the reality of 9/11 as a documentation of history in literature. This is a question to you, sir, by Dr. Indrani.
I'm glad you raised this question because it immediately points out what I mentioned in brief, which I couldn't probably elaborate, and that was that there is going to be in any representation, in any artistic, in an attempt to represent trauma, whether it is 9/11 or it is Holocaust, there will always be a tension in between the ethics of aesthetics and the politics of art. Because the minute we talk about Holocaust or 9/11, since the question is specifically on 9/11, what I would therefore observe here is that 9/11, has produced and continues to produce several narratives. In fact, 9/11 by itself has become a discourse. And within this larger discourse, what one calls a meta-narrative, there have been so many other narratives. And no two narratives, in fact, are often congruent with each other. There has been the official rhetoric. When 9/11 happened, there was the official rhetoric of the United States government. There was also the rhetoric of the then president of the United States, George Bush, who immediately said it's, the war on terror is between we and them. And so there was what he actually did and signaled was the othering of all Muslims and Arabs as the other. So there is always propaganda. There will always be narratives of propaganda. There will always be narratives of official rhetoric. And therefore, even somebody like Art Spiegelman, I can't see Indrani, but if she's there, even for Indrani, I would, Art Spiegelman himself went on to write another comic post 9/11 called In the Shadow of No Towers. And In the Shadow of No Towers, again, is a graphic account, on the one hand, of his own attempt to cope with the traumatic experience of 9/11, because on that day he himself was not only a witness, but he had to run downtown to a school where his daughter was studying. So it's not only a personal narrative on how to cope up with trauma of 9/11, but also it becomes a sort of catharsis, a national mourning or a national grieving, which provides a catharsis of the trauma of 9/11 on not just Americans, but people who were terrified or who were shocked beyond imagination by what had happened. Because remember, 9/11 was something that was unthinkable. The attack on the WTC towers and the Pentagon was something as if as if America, nothing could have touched America then, and yet it happened. So I would say that in response to your question, that every single traumatic event, whether it is Holocaust, 9/11, or for that matter, even pandemic, the ongoing crisis that we are experiencing, will develop many narratives. But what art therefore does is to ensure that it also writes small histories from below, that other than the official narrative, other than the official historiography, a history with a capital H, these are the other unknown, unvoiced, but unsilenced narratives. And these will always be alternative accounts that will provide a record of something that the history books will not write about.
Thank you, sir, for your answer. Any more questions? The forum is open.
I would like to
Yeah.
say something. Actually, last week in one presentation, Dr. Nilanjana Pathak mentioned that in her studies, showing her PowerPoint presentation, that during 9/11 World Trade Center sort of a trauma, a lot of literature was produced which documents the record. Actually, Actually, Americans were not fond of writing poems so much or reading poems, but the number of writing poems and reading poems multiplied manyfold during that time, and the poems became popular during in the aftermath of 9/11 event. So my question now is with Sir, that what about diaspora, which we call diaspora literature? Is it a trauma literature?
For trauma, for literature to be, yes, diasporic literature is also, broadly, you could say, it falls under the ambit of trauma literature. But not all diasporic fiction, for example, will qualify to the term trauma literature unless, as I said, it points out to some of the symptomatic manifestations that trauma brings into the characters. You know, there are literatures on war, but not all literature can be qualified as trauma literature. For example, I mean, just to give you an example that comes to my mind immediately, you know, Farewell to Arms. I mean, this is something, a standard classic text that we talk about in from war literature. To talk about war literature such as Farewell to Arms, Hemingway's Farewell to Arms, and place it alongside Eric Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front is almost impossible to do, because Eric Maria Remarque's story, you know, fiction, All Quiet on the Western Front, is a witness account, is a survivor's account. On the other hand, Farewell to Arms, in spite of the backdrop of the First World War, is essentially about love in the time of not cholera, but love in the time of war. So diasporic literature, well, there would be some, there always is, there can be examples from diasporic literature which would qualify as trauma literature, but with this rider that not diasporic fiction is traumatic fiction.
Thank you, sir, and thank you, Dr. Sachdev, for that remark and that very insightful question.
Can I add something to Dr. Sachdev's
Sure, sir.
query?
Please go ahead, sir.
You know, I've always been a firm believer that great crisis produces great literature, in the sense that, you know, whenever humanity is placed or challenged by a crisis, it is the human ingenuity and the human imagination which brings out new and innovative kind of writings that have never been attempted before. To give, since you talked about 9/11 again, one of the new forms of writings that came out was not just poetry, but something called Portraits of Grief. Now, Portraits of Grief was a new kind of obituary, call it obituary. look at the way in which today, when we open the newspapers, our eyes are automatically, in a very morbid way, we are looking at the obituary columns in a very, very sad way to find out if somebody we know, somebody that we may have known in the past figures. This is not a morbid activity, but what Portrait of Grief does, therefore, is to turn the conventional obituary, the missing persons of 9/11, into small narratives as profiles, using anecdotes in order to capture the essence of the victim who had passed away. So 9/11 itself brought out a new kind of writing called Portraits of Grief.
This is more so true, sir. And nowadays, so many COVID deaths are taking place. Jyoti Patil madam said that they have lost one colleague of theirs. Here also, we have been receiving news almost every day that we have lost so many of our colleagues. In social media and WhatsApp group, we are receiving the news every hour, every day that we have lost so many people. That is also a kind of, I think, what you have mentioned just now. Is another kind of grief is emerging.
True, sir. Very, very true. Very right. Any more remarks?
I
Any more,
to just
madam?
add on. Yeah, Shabni, madam, if you permit, I just want to add something. Should we call it immigrational trauma, as Sir Ashoka Sachdeva sir has just mentioned, or electric literature, or we can also include the natural disasters. Do you remember the gas tragedy, Bhopal gas tragedy, and great literatures are written, but they are not really paid so much of attention. If there is an international event, we pay a lot much of attention and literature is written.
Correct.
But what about our in Indian context things, as you talked about that partition trauma, as you just mentioned about your parents' narrative. Okay, so these things are perhaps not really highlighted on the international platform. So, what's your take? Prantik?
The reason is very simple. There is a politics of translation and a politics of publication. Not that there is an absence of literature. In fact, Bengali literature, or for that matter, Sindhi literature, or even Urdu literature has a profusion, and I'm sure you're aware of names like Sunil Gangopadhyay or Sadad Hasan Manto. All of these are about partition stories, are about trauma literature. But unfortunately, well, English rules, and therefore not much translation has been done. I do want to, at this point, I do want to say that since the example that I gave in my talk was essentially a graphic narrative, a comic narrative, one of the books that I read about almost 7 or 8 years back is on partition, but partition stories in comic form. This is a book called This Side, That Side, fully titled This Side and That Side. And just to show you how writers and artists can come together in collaborative in imaginative narratives of solidarity. What this group did was that the writers from India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh came together on a collaborative venture and gave, within a single volume or a collection, gave their own recountings of the partition. So within the covers of one book called This Side, That Side, you had so many narratives which, as I said, have never been documented about the partition in our national histories.
Yeah, we give so much of stress or undue, actually focus on diaspora literature, and it has turned into a kind of a branch and study. Why not about these trauma studies regarding natural disasters or unnatural disasters like gas tragedy?
No,
So, yeah.
Jyoti ma'am, no. There is now a new emerging field within studies called climate change, climate trauma. It's called climate trauma. And within climate trauma, there is a new kind of fiction that has been identified. What unfortunately it's called cli-fi. Climate fiction is called cli-fi, like sci-fi, it's called cli-fi. And and one of the texts that immediately should come to the minds of all of us on this meet is The Hungry Type by Amitav Ghosh.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, madam, and thank you, sir. You have asked so many, thought-provoking questions have been asked, and I think I have a question by Madam Indrani in the chat box. I would just be reading that out for you. Yes, can Dalit literature, especially autobiographies, be considered as traumatic literature, sir? This is a question by Ms. Professor Indrani Borkar.
Absolutely, absolutely. Again, to give another example from the same form of literature that I've been talking about, I don't exactly remember the name of the writer, but this is a comic book, an Indian comic book called Bhimayana, which obviously, as the title, Bhimayana, which as the title suggests, is a counter narrative to the Ramayana from the Dalit position. So yes, Dalit literature, especially Dalit autobiographies, would certainly come under the category of trauma.
So we have a lot of unexplored avenues in Indian and South Asian literature also, which can be termed as trauma literature, which in fact we were not aware of, sir. And your insightful talk today has opened so many avenues for us. And as I just told you, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of research and quality research in this area. I, for one, was taking many notes, and I was taking screenshots of your presentation feverishly. It has been a tremendous, gain for us intellectually, sir. Thank you. And if there are questions, I would now be moving on to the next step, or to the next step of our session. And we have amidst us today Dr. T.R. Muralikrishnan, who's chairing the session. And I would want to, he's a very familiar face on the iSPELL forum. I take this opportunity again to formally introduce Dr. T.R. Muralikrishnan. Dr. Muralikrishnan is an associate professor and head of the Department of English, MES Assambi College, Thrissur, Kerala. His publications include 2 books, 14 book chapters, 24 research papers, 9 articles in e-journals, and 7 articles in conference proceedings. He has chaired many sessions in national and international conferences. Dr. Muralikrishnan had been the NAC and IQAC coordinator for his institution for 2 successful accreditations. He has also completed a UGC-sponsored research project in the area of gender studies. Dr. Muralikrishnan has received the ELT Research Partnership granted by in 2014. I now invite Dr. Muralikrishnan to deliver the chairperson's remark on today's talk. Sir.
Am I audible there?
Yes, you are audible, sir.
Thank you very much. Now, with all respect, due respect to the let me now move on to the duty that has been bestowed on me, that is to chair the session. And as a, I should say, as a beginning to the entire, when I summarize the entire episode that I have watched, now I would like to quote from the speaker himself. To speak is impossible, and not to speak also is impossible, because I've been given this opportunity to talk about what he has already with all exact details of the necessity of the given topic. I would say that he has elaborated on that. Now, my duty is to consolidate those and to add if possible, but I'm not going to do that because we are already lagging behind in time. But I would say that it is like I'm also feeling like Hamlet, to begin from where he has stopped, like to move on to something like following the ghost, to move on to the unknown areas. Like you can maybe you might remember the scene where Hamlet is taken away by the ghost. Like he said, "Okay, my friends, please don't stop me. Let me move on." Now, then the ghost explains everything. Like similarly, I too. I should say, have moved on to a totally unknown area. And I think one particular phenomenon that I really liked about this particular session is the constant reference to memory. Now, I would say that this the idea of memory in relation to the neurobiological problems that we generally attach or generally associate with trauma, and the psychological kind of analysis that we generally attach with trauma. Now, these are aspects which are generally taken into consideration by almost all speakers. But I am fortunate to listen to Dr. Prantik Banerjee, because he has not dwelled deep unnecessarily into the theory part, but rather he was sticking on to the fundamentals, as well as he is relating the theory with beautiful examples. So we can easily follow the argument, even though he has got, I should say, all the necessary resources. For example, the critical idiom that he is using to support his argument. Even though the words are rather tough, for example, anthropomorphism. Now, those are words which take us to various dimensions. For example, that's the beauty of the entire discussion, because the entire gamut of theory has been discussed. One idea that I really appreciate regarding Dr. Prantik Banerjee is the total rejection of, I would say, from my perspective, to the kind of abstract theory proposed after the days of Saussure, and especially after the days of Alderman, and of course by 1990s, and bringing back the subject to what we call as something like back to humanities. Something that our students generally don't take it seriously. I should say, with the falling standards in reading and analysis of text, it is important that they should go back to the basics of reading the text and understanding, especially in relation to the idea of existence, the idea of the importance of life, the kind of things that we generally interact. Those basic ideas related to humanities are taken into consideration when it comes to what we call as the idea of trauma theory. So that way, I fully endorse the concept that he has given to us related to this particular topic. But maybe the women in this particular panel might ask him, where I don't know whether the question was there in the chat box, like for example, why father and sons? Why not mothers and daughters? That question might come to him. I don't know whether I should ask that question, but it is that is also an interesting area that we need to ponder upon. Of course, sir, I'm not asking you anything, but I think even this kind of moving from one generation to another, even seeing things from the women's perspective is also interesting. Like that can also add, especially when we talk about partition, there is a lot of abuse. I'm not just referring to the sexual abuse that are constantly referred to, but I am also referring to the patriarchal norms that are generally taken as an underpinning to the narrative of partition, and also part of the Dalit movement, also Dalit literature. Also, we generally talk about the what we call as the double displaced, or rather what we call as they are actually far removed from the society, not just as a man, but even as a matter of woman also. So I think that can also be some area of kind of a interest for as far as research is concerned. And primarily, I'm interested more related to the multiple readings, especially from the perspective of politics, because you cannot do away with that in relation to what we call as analyzing of text. It is not a matter of just 9 bar 11, because I would say, I have even written an article on that, interestingly, related to something like, I would say that 9 bar 11, after that, when you look into the standard narratives or the government narratives as produced by the Bush administration, you can see that there is this constant search for an enemy. Now, there is this idea of they need to concentrate an enemy and then focus on him, and then tell the world that, okay, there is, as he has made a reference about us and them. like who is right and who is wrong. That kind of duality and binary is already there, in most of our, and I think that is also very much there when we talk about the Indian politics also. So one cannot fully, like leave out politics in writing, especially these days. So and I would certainly understand what people like Jyoti Patil ma'am has, Professor Jyoti Patil ma'am has said, like related to the idea of partition, the related to the idea of riots, very important. In the Indian context, we have seen major riots over the period of last 60 years, and of course there are lots of writing and the idea of trauma related to that. And I think that is a crucial area that we need to like bring up, rather than pushing those things under the carpet and saying that everything is good about our nation and celebrating in one way or the other. So multiple reading is a unique chance if you take up this particular perspective, especially when we talk about trauma, because then if you go into the details of the hierarchy of the society, just go into the background and go to the backward people there, ask them what trauma is, they would say that what is happiness is all about. Because for them, even everyday existence, in a way, is a matter of trauma. So politics, I think, is a very important concern as far as the writing is concerned. I'm happy that he has made a clear mention about that in his deliberations. So thank you very much, sir. I don't want to take more time on this. I was only trying to give my kind of an impressions and reading. I have gained a lot, I should say, through this, by attending this particular session. And I'm sure my friends in the panel or friends who are sitting there who are watching this particular program, they are going to benefit a lot, because next time when we go to a classroom situation, we can of course add a few more dimensions into the idea of reading a text, rather than going through the predictable routine of what new critic said, what structuralist said, what post structuralist said, etc. But there can be some more additions to that. So thank you, sir. It was really interesting. It is really exciting, and I thank iSPELL for giving me this opportunity to interact with Dr. Prantik, and of course chairing this session also. So with these few words, let me hand over the responsibility to Shabanandas. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Dr. Murli Krishnan. And you have given a very power-packed, I would say, a very pithy and a power-packed summary to the very power-packed session that we have had this evening. I know it was a difficult task because there is so much of matter that was shared by Sir, Dr. Prantik Banerjee. I know summarizing that in a nutshell is indeed the Herculean task that you have done so beautifully. And for me personally, this has been the most invigorating and stimulating Saturday evening that I've had in I would say, a few months. So thank you for making our weekend so fruitful, Dr. Prantik Banerjee. With the permission of the chair, now I have Ms. Priyanka to carry forward the ceremony or to carry forward the closure of the session.
Thank you very much, ma'am. It was a very wonderful and fascinating session. Although I was having some trouble with the audio, but still the talk was very fascinating and very attention gripping. So first of all, I would like to invite Mr. Pramod Dangle sir to give the certificates of appreciation. Dr. Pramod sir, are you there? So, Pramod sir? So, I think I'll have to move forward.
Madam, I mean, if what sir has observed, our chairperson has observed, if Prantik Banerjee has to say something to give his input into it, he is most welcome. So let's give a chance. Yeah.
Yes, sir. Please, sir.
I think it's been a long, extended evening, and except for the fathers and sons and mothers and daughters, if only Shakespeare had a sister or Hamlet had a sister, right? Judith Virginia Woolf talked about Shakespeare having a sister. So maybe in future, Hamlet might have in a new in a new by a new writer, there might be a sequel to Hamlet where Judith plays center stage and not Hamlet.
Yeah.
No, I think.
Yeah. Over to the master of ceremonies.
So the master of ceremonies or the moderator?
Moderator. Right.
Okay, thank you very much, sir. So, sir, okay, first I will then give my vote of
No, you ask Mr. Pramod to share the certificates, please.
Okay, Mr. Pramod, sir, are you there? Can you please share the certificates?
Thank you very much, Dr. Prantik, for bringing a very insightful topic onto the platform of iSPELL. And not only the educators have enjoyed it, but also the research scholars and students, those who have joined us, have come across a new avenue into the trauma literature. All the time we were talking about the literature, the other part of the literature, but at the back of literature, what trauma actually is and how trauma has to be brought into the focus and what kind of sentiments that we observe and aesthetics which are being implied into it are being brought onto the forum of iSPELL. So thank you very much for taking a very insightful and a wonderful topic. And this is a small token from iSPELL. Kindly accept it. So this is the certification for a wonderful deliberation on trauma literature. Thank you very much, sir. So thanks a lot to our Vice President who is chairing today's session, Dr. Murali Krishnan TR. So this certificate goes to you for your wonderful insight into the topic and moreover, the way you all the time manage the show. Thank you very much, sir. And the Master of Ceremonies who has taken the ship to what we call to the port, and she has taken up all the questions. She has initiated the topic and the way she has introduced the resource person and the chairperson, and moreover her own insight into this trauma literature. Dr. Shabnam Das Manna, this certificate goes to you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
And this certificate goes to the moderator, Priyanka Sharma. We would like to add doctor, because we wish you all the very best, so that you can add doctor in front of your name. So we would love to share this Dr. Priyanka Sharma to you, but now we are giving it as Priyanka Sharma. So do accept this.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you.
So thank you very much. Over to Priyanka.
Yes, sir. Now, finally, as we are moving towards the end of this session. Now, I would like to give a vote of thanks. First of all, I want to thank Dr. Prantik Banerjee, sir, who gave us his precious time and shared his knowledge. And he has definitely given us many new insights and perspectives to the famous works of literature and to the traumatic events of history. And he made us familiar with many new terms like post-memory and intergenerational traumas. These words are not very much known to everyone. So thank you very much, sir, for that. Then I want to thank Dr. Murali Krishnan, sir, for giving his valuable insight and his valuable remarks on the topic. Dr. Murali Krishnan, sir, as we have seen, is always ready to help students, and he never ceases to give his valuable time to the learners. Thank you very much, sir. And then I want to thank Dr. Shabnam Madam for managing this whole event flawlessly. And then I want to thank Dr. Ghanshyam, sir, for his ceaseless efforts to